He ran out of the factory and he went home. And he was so upset with himself that he just paced and paced and paced. And finally, he's like, he couldn't get comfortable. And so he decided to go downtown. So he goes downtown and he's walking around the shops and he wanders into a bookstore and he picks up a copy of Tolstoy's diary. And he opened the book at random. It just fell open. And the first words that his eyes fell on were, "The conscience is the voice of God." Then Covey went on to teach this concept of the two consciences, which has been one of the most helpful things I have ever learned. These two consciences are always at battle in our mind. It's a little bit like the imagery of the devil and the angel on our shoulders, right? We're listening to one or the other, and it's a real battle. It causes internal struggle and turmoil. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. I am Audrey Rindlisbacher. I am the author of The Mission Driven Life and the founder of The Mission Driven Mom. And as I have mentioned on this podcast before, I am working on my new book, How Truth Makes You Free. And this book is in two parts, and part one goes through the framework of what that really means. Why does truth making us free matter? What is the actual nature of truth? How does the framework of truth work? And what is the mechanism by which we know what is true? So I've been working on this mechanism chapter of how you and I identify what is true, how we parse that out and discern that. And there's lots of really cool stories I could tell you. One of my very favorites that I do mention in the book is the story of Shinichi Suzuki, which you can hear on his Mission Driven Story, a previous podcast I did, where his father owned a violin factory. He actually didn't play one. He didn't really actually know what they were for. And he went into the factory one day to work. He was like 17, 18 years old. Typewriters were kind of a newish thing. And there was a typewriter there. He'd never had one. He'd never worked on one. And so he sits down and he just starts typing on this typewriter. And just then the manager of the factory comes in and kind of freaks out for a minute and is like, "Master Shinichi, what are you doing with that typewriter? You can't type on it without paper in it or it'll ruin it." And Suzuki immediately says, "Oh, I wasn't typing. I was just had my fingers on the keys." He knew that he had lied, and the manager just left the room, was like, "Oh, okay, I didn't know." And he is filled with contrition against himself. He is so angry with himself for telling this lie. He's like, "What a stupid lie. Why did I lie about such a dumb thing?" Which actually speaks well of his character because he was upset by telling such a small lie. Anyway, he ran out of the factory and he went home. And he was so upset with himself that he just paced and paced and paced. And finally, he's like, he couldn't get comfortable. And so he decided to go downtown. So he goes downtown and he's walking around the shops and he wanders into a bookstore and he picks up a copy of Tolstoy's diary. And he opened the book at random. It just fell open. And the first words that his eyes fell on were, "The conscience is the voice of God." And that a man who lies to himself is worse than lying to other people. He determines that he is going to live according to his conscience from that moment on. And he commits himself. He buys the book, he takes it home. He said he devoured it, he took it everywhere he went. And from that moment forward in his life, he committed that he would strive to always follow his conscience. And then, of course, he became this incredible person. And I have said this on the podcast many times, but I could give you so many examples of great men and women who, in their own telling of their own life story, talk about one moment or another when they determined to do this, when they recognized that their conscience was trying to guide them to better actions and better outcomes, and that the way forward for them was to seek out, listen to, and obey their own consciences. So the mechanism by which we know the truth is our conscience. And I was reading some things today and I was just thinking about what an absolute miracle it is. I've spoken a lot, I've done a lot of events, and I have done this activity multiple times where I have asked people to take just a minute and answer some sort of question about what they should do now moving forward in their life. And every single time, every single person that I've ever done this activity with, which is thousands of people at this point, has said that they knew at least one thing that they needed to do. To me, that's just such an incredible miracle that you would know immediately what to do when you simply just sat still with yourself and listened. Listened to what? Listen to who? Well, this conscience is trying to guide you, and you can always anticipate that were you to take this action that your conscience was telling you to take, that you know that your life would be better. And then many people go home and they do that, and then they report that their life actually is better. It's this amazing, miraculous tool that we have by which we can seek truth for our own behavior, and we can know, we can discern what's true and what's false and take action in our lives. But Stephen Covey was the one that turned me on to something called the divine conscience. He tells a story of a man who is actually a friend of his. And this friend had, it sounds like, I don't know, his parents had some issues. I'm sure they were nice people, but when he was growing up or being taught to drive, I guess, he was told that if he ran a stop sign or didn't come to a complete stop, that he needed to go around the block 3 times to make penance. And so you can imagine if his parents taught him that, there's probably other funky things his parents taught him. But the point was that it was this weird behavior that he felt like he needed to engage in because it had kind of been like beaten into him, like this big deal had been made growing up that if you ran a stop sign, you had to make penance. And so one time he was talking to Covey and he told him this story and he said, that's why I just feel like sometimes it's best to ignore your conscience and just listen to common sense. And I don't know if Covey already had the concept of the two consciences at that point, or if it developed as a consequence of thinking about this man's experience and other people's experiences. But then Covey went on to teach this concept of the two consciences, which has been one of the most helpful things I have ever learned. And I thought I would just touch on it today. I'll go into more depth in it in the chapter in my book, which will come out in the next few months and you can read it for yourself. But for today, I just wanted to familiarize you with this idea because it's so insanely helpful. So if you look up the term social conscience, what you get is consciousness or social consciousness. And it's this popular idea that we should, and it's not a bad idea, but that we should care about our society and we should try to right the wrongs in our society and correct it and make amends for the poor and the needy and all those who struggle, which is great, which is a great thing to do. But it's not what I'm talking about. It's not what Covey is talking about. He's talking about something different. It's not talking about righting the wrongs of society. So Covey talked about a social conscience and a divine conscience. And the story of this man going around the block 3 times, there are dozens of stories that we could tell like this. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll probably think of some in your own life. And what he's saying in this example is that needing to go around the block 3 times was a manifestation of what Covey would call his social conscience. So society had taught him this weird habit. His family, his social environment had taught him to do something that was just completely unnecessary. Whereas his common sense, or what Covey calls his divine conscience, overruled that nonsensical behavior and helped him know you actually don't need to do that. So, what this looks like in our day to day lives is that there's a mechanism one way of talking about it, Thomas Reed taught that the natural law is written on the hearts of mankind by the finger of God. So what he's basically saying, and I could give you many, many quotes on the conscience and it being written on our hearts, is that there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. And the first principle of the natural law is to seek the good. And so we know that by our very nature. It's the fabric of what we are as human beings. We know there's a right, we know there's a wrong, we know that we should pursue what's right. And we also have a pretty decent sense, even as young children, of what that right and wrong is, even when the social environment that children are in is unhealthy. They often can see through that and understand that things are wrong in their home or they're being taught wrong things because this intuitive sense of right and wrong is so built in. And Covey calls it divine because it comes from God, from a higher power, from somewhere outside of us. It leads us to light, to goodness, to truth, to beauty, to what we ought to be doing and what we ought to not be doing that is best for us individually and as a society. If we listen to that, if we get attuned with it, then our life goes better. Anyone will tell you that when they got serious about listening to their conscience, their life went better. The social conscience is how we are trained. It is what we're taught as children, but it's also bigger than that. It's the world around us, the society, the culture in which we're entrenched. And that social conscience, the collective ideas of right and wrong, if you think of conscience as the mechanism by which you discern what's true, by which you know what's right and wrong, and you know how to behave in the world, then you can see that the divine conscience would be the things that are truly, intrinsically, objectively right and wrong, good and true and beautiful, that you should comply with, and that the social conscience is just wherever society is at. Society has its own idea of what is right and wrong, and what is good and true and beautiful, and how we ought to behave. And if you know your history at all, you can see that the social conscience shifts. It changes over time. Premarital sex 100 years ago was so against all societal norms. In fact, there were laws back in American history and all throughout the West, punishments for premarital sex or extramarital sex of any kind. And so today, it's very mainstreamed, and many people do it without thinking twice. And one of the reasons that they do that is because the social conscience is so loud. Now, maybe the first time they engage in that behavior, they have some hesitation. They're not sure about how they feel about it. They have to get their minds around it. There's this old sitcom. Oh, I can't remember the name of it right now. It had Valerie Bertinelli in it. You might remember if I say that. It was about this single mom and her two daughters. There was an episode on that show where this girl had a boyfriend and she was thinking about having sex with this boyfriend. It was fascinating because she went to her mother specifically and said, you know, is this right or wrong? Should I do this or not? And the mom just was like, I can't think of any good reasons why you shouldn't, but I don't want you to. And it was just such a good example of they'd lost their faith. And this mom's dialogue was such that she's not deferring to God. And society is now saying, we've got the pill, it's okay. And so she can't come up with a logical argument based on the social conscience around her of a reason why her daughter shouldn't do this, but she didn't want her daughter to. So the social conscience was saying, it's fine, no big deal. But her intuitive divine conscience was still hesitating, was still holding back for the mother and the daughter. They were both struggling with whether or not they should do this. And in the end, the girl felt uncomfortable, pushed off the boyfriend, and he ended up breaking up with her because she wouldn't do that. And it showed her who she was really dating because she wanted to wait. So these two consciences are always at battle in our mind. It's a little bit like the imagery of the devil and the angel on our shoulders, right? We're listening to one or the other, and it's a real battle. When the divine conscience is out of sync with the social conscience, it causes internal struggle and turmoil. And the wider that gap becomes, the more difficult it is to find your way morally. It becomes more and more difficult to actually discern the truth. And so the solution, as Stephen Covey teaches it, is to educate the divine conscience, to become more and more attuned to what is intrinsically and objectively real and true and right, and to listen when your conscience tells you not to do something or to do something. And by virtue of doing that, to strengthen your own character, to become more virtuous yourself by living in line with virtue and the divine law, the natural law, those true principles that govern human behavior. That we can, in the words of Cecil B. DeMille, we can't break them, but we can break ourselves against them. The ways that we can educate this divine conscience, there's so many good ways. I'll get to those in just a minute, but it's so vital that we understand that that social conscience can be very oppressive. It can be telling us, you should believe this, you should support this, you should let this go by, you should tolerate this or that other behavior that just feels intrinsically wrong to you. That's a real difficult thing to navigate. And as we know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, here in the United States, the social conscience and the divine conscience were far more aligned, far more in sync and in harmony with each other. And so, even though people are people and they're going to do what they do, at least they didn't have society patting them on the back for doing something that was just not honorable. Some things that are inherently wrong, if we aren't raised to know that they're wrong and society keeps telling us they're not wrong and we don't educate the divine conscience, we will eventually just agree with the social conscience. You see, if we don't pull back, if we don't educate the divine conscience, there won't be anything to juxtapose against the social conscience. We will just go with the times. We will just go with the flow. And whatever society is telling us is good or bad or right or wrong, we will just do it. Now, we do have a divine conscience written on our hearts, and we will have some guilt when we do some things wrong. We'll just know we shouldn't have lied. We'll know we shouldn't have cheated. We shouldn't have cut that corner. We shouldn't have, you know, whatever the case might be. But if we don't course correct, and if we don't make the change, if we don't tell ourselves the truth about how our behavior was out of alignment with what we know to be right, and then course correct, we will deaden our conscience. Literally, we will beat it down and beat it down to the point, and you can see this with people who didn't used to engage in certain behaviors and felt badly when they did, and then the more that they did them, the less guilty they felt over time. It just became normal. They worked their way into a new normal. And if we're going to juxtapose what we know is actually real, which is the objective natural law, the moral law given to us by God, we're going to have to educate ourselves in it and align our behavior with it so that we have something to posit against the social conscience. And it's also become clear to me that as we do this, that we can affect the social conscience, and that in some kind of cosmic way, we all have some responsibility for the social conscience because we are all contributing to it or taking from it. I hate to bring up Hitler's Germany again. There's a book Jordan Peterson recommended. I will link it. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it's a study that was done of very average, typical 30, 40 something men, most of them with families coming from normal careers. And they were put in the war. They were given certain positions. They were told to do certain things that felt incredibly uncomfortable to them at the beginning or that they refused to do at first. They knew them to be wrong. And then the social pressure around them and the need to have belonging and to not stand out and be different than the people around them caused them to engage in these behaviors. And over the 1.5 to 2 years that they engaged in these behaviors, they became very comfortable with mass killings of Jews. It didn't take a long time to go from being an average normal guy who's never really held a gun much to being someone who can march Jewish children out to a ditch in the woods and gun them down. So this is how we all participate in making the world a better or worse place. We contribute to the social conscience by being people that fight against it, that work to correct it, that live according to our own consciences and shine forth better examples. Or we can be the people that go along because we want to keep our job, because people are looking at us and it's uncomfortable, because it doesn't seem like that's a too big of a deal, and we make compromises and we rationalize. Or we can be the people that worked to make the social conscience healthier. So, how do we educate our divine conscience? Well, we do that in a handful of ways. First of all, seeing that that divine conscience is a mechanism given to us by God, well, then we get to know God better. We do that by building a relationship, by reading his words, by working to become more like God. We also can learn about men and women who followed their consciences, and we can strive to follow their examples. We can make regular commitments with ourselves to do small things that turn into bigger things as we sculpt our own character by obeying our conscience over time. We can also learn more about the conscience. The word conscience means knowledge with. And so this is knowledge that we hold with God and with others. It's really, really fascinating to me. We can also teach about it and fight against things that are wrong in the social conscience, be actual advocates for what we know to really be true. We can stand up in small ways and build internal strength to stand up when the big tests come. And as we do that, as we work to fine tune our own divine conscience, to develop our character to become more virtuous, we not only gain the beautiful fruits of that in our personal lives, but we also positively impact our own intimate circles and spheres of influence. And then those circles of influence slowly grow as we gain influence over others because of who we have become. And eventually, if enough of us do this, if we really educate our divine consciences and work like Suzuki and so many others to correct the social conscience, then we can see the beautiful fruits of that. This was the tension that was happening in our nation in the 1800s. A practice had crept into our nation, juxtaposed the North and the South. The North was against it, and the South was for slavery. And it created this tension in our nation for the first 100 years that was an ongoing battle about the social conscience. And the right won. We gave our lives. Hundreds of thousands of men and boys, white and black, gave their lives to fight against an egregious practice and to get our social conscience in a better line with a greater truth, which is so beautiful. The social conscience was corrected. And then over time, men and women came along that helped us see each other as more equals and to put each other on an equal playing field and to give blacks more and more and more opportunities in our nation. Until now, we've had a black president and great black leaders and wealthy, wealthy people around the world. So really beautiful things can happen when we do the work to align our lives with our divine conscience and to educate it properly. And then we work to build a healthier social conscience. There are so many areas where our social conscience could use some fixing up. So, my challenge to me and to you and to all of us is to work right now, today, to educate our own divine conscience, to live more in line with what we know to be good and true and right, and to recognize that we are the greatest beneficiaries of that. And it does make a difference when we do that. And another key way that we can do that is to find true principles and live according to them in every area of our lives. The MTM Academy helps you to do that. You can get the Mission Driven Life book that teaches you the 7 laws of life mission. That's a kickstarting place that you can go to as well. But ultimately, as we all do this, we can make our world a better, more beautiful, more good and whole place to live. Thank you so much for joining me today. and I will see you next time.